Right, well today I'm going to talk about population change in Britain. Can you hear me, or should I get the microphone? It seems silly to use you can hear. Yeah, it seems silly to use a microphone for 3 people. I'm talking about births, deaths, marriages, divorce, immigration and emigration in Britain in the first half of the 20th century. But I think when talking about Britain, it's important to have some definitions, because it's a more complicated place, and we always realize, and we use different names for different parts of the country. When we talk about the United Kingdom, we mean England plus Wales, plus Scotland, plus Ireland. The whole of Ireland until the South became independent in 1922. Now it's just the north of Ireland, which belongs to the rest of the United Kingdom. Then when we say Great Britain, we mean just Scotland, England and Wales, the big island, and not Ireland. And then we say Britain as a rather sort of vague term that includes anything. These differences are quite important if you're looking at statistics, for example, births or deaths, because sometimes statistics are quoted for just England and Wales, sometimes Great Britain, sometimes the United Kingdom. And obviously it makes a difference how large the population is. And it can be quite confusing when you're reading about all of this. Oh, sorry. We used to say England, meaning the whole lot. And sometimes people in other countries still do that. But we try not to, because it upsets the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh if we pretend it's all England, quite reasonably. And it matters also because, as I mentioned last week, there are important differences culturally and legally between the different countries. I gave the example last week of the divorce law, where in Scotland men and women could divorce each other on the same grounds from as early as 1643, over 300 years ago. But in England and Wales, there was no such equality until the 20th century, 1925. And it didn't become as easy to get a divorce until 1969. Ireland, on the other hand, had no divorce at all until 1939, because the Roman Catholic Church is very powerful and against divorce. And Northern Ireland adopted the English law of 1969, not until 1978. So the laws operate at different times in the different countries. Similarly, abortion became legal in Scotland, England and Wales in 1967 for the first time, but it's still illegal in the whole of Ireland, including in Northern Ireland. So there are quite significant differences. Also in Scotland, couples who are not married could live together with the same legal rights as a married couple until 1940, when that ended. But it wasn't allowed in England and Wales or Ireland until quite recently. So it's important to know those differences exist. So I begin by looking at the period before 1900, of the 19th century. Official registration of all births, marriages and deaths was introduced in England and Wales in 1837. Every birth, every marriage, every death has to be officially registered. It's introduced in Scotland in 1855, Ireland in 1864, and it does mean we have good statistics from that time, good national statistics. Also from 1801, there's been a national census every 10 years. And these were introduced because people were aware that the population was growing and wanted to understand why and how fast it was growing. For earlier periods, historians of population have used church registers because the church registered the ceremonies attached to bringing newborn children into the church, marriages and burials, and that gives quite good information about patterns of population going back to the late 16th century. So for England and Wales particularly, particularly England, there are good statistics over many centuries, unusually in Europe. The picture in the 19th century is of a generally high birth rate, with a high proportion of women giving birth to many children over their whole reproductive lifetime. But marriage age was late, so they started normally to have children at a relatively late age. The average was 25, and had been for centuries. In Northern Europe particularly, there was tradition of late marriage. But there are also very high death rates amongst infants and children. So not all babies who were born grew up. And the number of surviving children in the family could be quite small. Death rates became worse in the 19th century as towns grew and living conditions were unhealthy. By the mid-19th century, Britain was the most urbanised country in the world. The towns grew very early. Also, quite a lot of women were infertile. So the average number of children in a family would be 5 or 6. Then maybe only 3 or 4 of those would survive to be adults. Sometimes not even so many. Then from the 1870s, there was a fall in the birth rate in all social classes, which continued to the 1930s. Why it started to go down has been very much debated by historians, and we don't really know why. There are important differences in different parts of the country which affected all social classes, and nobody quite understands those. Sometimes they relate to religious belief. Roman Catholics tended to have larger families, but even that doesn't quite explain it. Overall, the main reason seems to have been a desire to improve family living standards. Parents realising if they had fewer children, everyone's standard would be better. Also, women were getting to be better educated, more independent, wanted more control over their lives, so that their lives weren't dominated by being pregnant, giving birth, having miscarriages, having babies die, and the ill health that went with repeated pregnancy and childbirth. But still, birth rates remained quite high into the early 20th century. The most common method of restricting births was to give up sex, or to use an interrupted sexual act, so they didn't complete it. Contraceptives were, particularly the condom, was available, but it was quite expensive for many people, and they found it unfamiliar. Right up there, Pansy. I'm talking about what's happening to the birth rate, as you can see. Another way of restricting the number of births was abortion, which I said was illegal, and it was dangerous. But it was probably quite common, especially among poorer women. All kinds of preparations were sold in shops, or they would jump up and down, or take very hot baths. It's the same in all countries. There were terrible techniques that women used to try to bring a pregnancy to an end, and they were often very dangerous. Or in many districts there'd be a woman who would be the local abortionist, but she'd have to be paid, and they couldn't always afford that. But we've no idea how common abortion was. You only know about it when someone is brought to the law court for committing abortions, or if a woman dies. But that happens so often that obviously a lot of it did go on. So by these various means, the birth rate went on falling. Also, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th, there was a big campaign, particularly by women's groups, to reduce the death rate among infants and children. Because obviously if your children are being born, and there's quite a lot of concern about the falling population, then one way to counter that is to make sure that babies don't die. So there are campaigns, and also both women's groups and local government set up clinics to advise mothers on bringing up children, on breastfeeding them, for example, because it was better for them, and on the care of children. And the infant death rate did gradually go down until the 1930s. And there's also a campaign to improve the health of children by providing meals in schools and medical care through the schools. And this was introduced in the years before 1914. Because there was a great deal of concern about the decline in the death rate, people saw it as somehow signifying national decline. If the country couldn't produce so many children, then it must be getting weaker. These kinds of changes were happening all over Europe at the time. Looking at marriage rates, quite a lot of people didn't marry in the 19th century and before. Among women, this is partly because they're a majority of the population, because women had longer life expectancy than men, and also men were much more likely to migrate abroad, and many of them did. Around 10 to 15% of all women never married, but also about 9% of all men. once they were married, as I said last week, it was hard to divorce in England, Wales and Ireland, though not in Scotland. In England and Wales, it's difficult to divorce until 1969. And as I said earlier, there was no divorce at all in Ireland before 1939, and then only in Northern Ireland, not in the Republic of Ireland. Nevertheless, marriages did break up, and this led to numbers of lone mothers, mothers bringing up children on their own, and also to cohabitation, couples living together who were not married because one or other couldn't get divorced, which in England and Wales and Ireland had to be secret because it wasn't legally allowed and it was stigmatised. But it was allowed in Scotland, where it was legal. And at the beginning of the 20th century, about 12% of all couples were registered as unmarried but living together, which is about the same number as now, which is quite interesting. And the extent of couples living together, even in the early 20th century, though we've no idea of the numbers in England and Wales, must have been reasonably high because it was recognised by the government at certain points. For example, during the First World War, for the first time, the government paid allowances to the families of men who were away in the armed services. And they found that quite a lot of the men wanted to claim for women they lived with but were not married to. And so the government had to agree to giving allowances to people they described as unmarried wives. And also after the war, when there was quite high unemployment, they gave unemployment benefits to unmarried partners, provided that they had lived together for quite a long time. It was stable, and they had children. That was seen as a sign of a stable relationship. So although the law didn't recognise this situation and nobody talked about it, it was recognised by the government in certain important ways, which suggests it must have been quite widespread. And of course the children of these unmarried partnerships were technically illegitimate because they weren't married. In the mid-19th century, when we first have statistics, about 7% of all births in England and Wales were illegitimate. Their parents were not married. And that went on until the First World War. But there were higher levels of illegitimacy in parts of Scotland, particularly in some coastal, rural areas, fishing areas. And I gather from Professor Okai, who's in the States, that she's found similar things in Japan. Places, a particular place she's been studying in the south, near Nagasaki, which is a fishing area, where there were high levels of accepted illegitimacy. It was normal, and the mothers brought up children on their own. And this is also true in parts of Scotland, but why it's true, nobody quite understands. Then during the First World War, the level of illegitimacy went up in England and Wales also. And there was a great panic about it. It was thought that young people were becoming particularly immoral. During the war, they were moving around more, they were meeting each other more. It's more likely, though, that what was happening was that women who got pregnant before marriage, who before the war would have married, were not able to do so during the war because the man was away, or he was killed, or he'd moved on. It was quite common, it seems, for women to be pregnant when they got married, for couples to have sexual relationships, sometimes for quite a long time, and then only to marry when the woman was pregnant. Again, how often that was, we don't know. Until just before the Second World War, when for the first time the government started collecting statistics of exactly when children were born in relation to marriage. This was because they were concerned about the birth rate going down and wanted to find out exactly what was going on. So for the first time in 1938, there was an official count which discovered as many as 30% of first births followed on from a pregnancy that started before the marriage. And that was before the war. Then again, during the Second World War, there was a growth in the numbers of illegitimate children, and again a big panic about it. And particularly young women in the armed forces were said to be particularly immoral. But this time, the official statistics showed very clearly that the numbers of births within the first 9 months of marriage had gone down by a similar number to the increase in illegitimate babies. So it was fairly clear that what was happening was that the couples just couldn't get married in time. Sometimes they married later because the man was away at war, or sometimes killed in war, or a prisoner of war. But it was interesting that those statistics came along just in time to enable us to work out, and people at the time eventually to work out what was really going on. It does seem from surveys, both before the Second World War, social surveys, and again just after the Second World War, that about 30% of the births that were registered as illegitimate in peacetime were the children of parents who were living together and carried on living together after the birth of the child. And generally, as I've said, these couples would be people where one partner at least couldn't get a divorce. But there were other women who became pregnant when they weren't married and didn't have a regular male partner, which might happen because of a casual relationship or a relationship that broke down, could be due to rape, or because a man pretended to be unmarried and turned out to be married, leaving the woman on her own. Mothers who had children without a male partner were heavily socially stigmatized, and so were the children. Illegitimate children had quite high death rates, often because the mothers were poor, had very little support, sometimes gave birth on their own without medical help. So there were many reasons why the child didn't have much of a chance. Or the child might be adopted at birth because the mother couldn't bring him or her up. In Britain, adoption most often happens when a child is very young, shortly after birth. In fact, there was no legal adoption in Britain until 1926. It's only then that a legal procedure was introduced. It had always happened that children were brought up by families other than the families in which they were born. They might be brought up by relatives or by other people, but they didn't have the legal status of children of the people who brought them up. The difference the Adoption Act made was that if a child was legally adopted, he or she became the child of the adopting parents and had the same legal rights as any other children. It was also possible after 1926 for an unmarried mother to adopt her child. And the reason for doing that again was to increase the legal rights of the child. For example, if the mother died without leaving a will, if the child was legitimate, he or she would automatically inherit any property left by the mother. If the child was illegitimate, they wouldn't. They weren't allowed to. So if she adopted them, the child, then it could inherit and could also inherit from grandparents. It wasn't until the 1980s that illegitimate children got exactly the same legal rights as all legitimate children. Also, children might be adopted by the mother and her husband if she then married someone who was not the child's father. Or sometimes the real parents might marry at a later stage and adopt the child. Or the mother's own parents or other members of the family or friends might adopt them. It was also possible for single people to adopt after 1926, both men and women. And they quite often did. This was heavily restricted in 1948 because people began to realise the dangers, particularly of some men adopting young children. They became worried about sexual abuse of children, which again had always gone on, but nobody talked about it at this time. So adoption was one thing that might happen to an illegitimate child, though mothers often did it very unwillingly. The other thing that happened quite frequently was that the mother might return to her own family and her mother and father would help bring up the child, perhaps enabling the mother to go out to work while the grandmother looked after the child. Quite often the child would then grow up thinking that the grandmother was his or her mother and the grandfather was the father. And they would often be encouraged to believe this, so they didn't know they were illegitimate, and other people weren't supposed to know that they were illegitimate. And they believed that their mother was their sister. This was easier to do at a time of very large families, where it was not so unusual for there to be 15 or even 20 years separating a brother or sister. So it didn't seem quite so odd, particularly if the grandmother was not very old and the mother was quite young, as often happened. Sometimes the child would find out the truth and it would be a great shock. There are some memoirs of people. One, for example, by Eric Clapton, the rock star, who discovered when he was, I think, in his teens, that his mother was really his sister. I mean, or his sister was his mother, and his grandmother was his his mother was his grandmother, because he thought his mother was his grandmother. And it could be a cause of great mental anguish and depression. But I was listening to a radio interview with a very famous British scientist and a Nobel Prize winner who discovered only in his 50s that that was his situation, that the people he thought were his parents were his grandparents. By the time he learned that, he was very successful and he was older, so it was not so much of a shock. But he did say he always wondered why he was so much cleverer than the people he thought were certainly more successful at school than the people he thought were his brothers. And he must have had a very clever father. Only he knows who his father is. So there are a lot of these really rather, well, I mean, that's not a particularly unhappy story, but some of the others are very unhappy stories. And again, we've no idea how many people grew up in these situations, but it's common enough for many stories to have survived. Also, the mother might marry, as I've said, she might eventually marry the real father or marry somebody else. If it was somebody else, the husband might accept the child or might be very hostile to bringing up another man's child. If he did reject the child, then it might stay with the mother's family or with other relatives, or might be sent to an orphanage to be brought up. Mothers who had good incomes could bring up their children on their own. They could pretend to be widows and nobody would know, particularly if they moved to a new district. Poorer women had a much harsher time. They might be helped by charities, some of whom ran hostels for unmarried mothers and their children, where they could live with their children, maybe go out to work. Many of these were run by religious organizations and were very strictly disciplined. Effectively, they were punishing the mothers by making them obey very strict rules about when they could come and go, how they could dress, what they could do. And they were very unpopular with women. The only alternative provided by the public welfare system was through the Poor Law, which was the long-established traditional welfare system in Britain that I'll talk about next week. Under the Poor Law, they would either be in institutions known as workhouses, or allowed to stay at home with their child with a very small amount of money. Either way, it was fairly harsh treatment, and receiving poor relief was very much stigmatized. Some unmarried mothers were placed in mental hospitals in the 1920s and 30s. Being an unmarried mother was seen by some people to be a sign of mental illness, mental instability. And in fact, some elderly women were found in mental hospitals in the early 1970s, who'd been there since the 1920s, having been put there because they had legitimate children. Nothing wrong with them. They'd just been placed there when they were young and left. This treatment of unmarried mothers was an aspect of a quite strong concern at this time, particularly throughout the first half of the 19th century, about the quality, the fitness of the population. As I said earlier, there was a lot of concern around the declining birth rate that it somehow symbolized the increasing weakness, the kind of failure of the population. And this particularly came to the fore at the very beginning of the 20th century, when the British Army was at war in South Africa. South Africa, which was part of the British Empire, there was a movement to break away from the empire, led mainly by Dutch migrants to South Africa. And the British Army had great difficulty in defeating this. They did in the end, but it took 3 years. And the quality of men volunteering for the army, many of them were found to be physically unfit. And this also gained a lot of publicity and added to these fears that somehow the population of Britain was deteriorating, becoming physically weak. And this was particularly worrying at a time when there was conflict in Europe. There was a fear of war, particularly with Germany, and a feeling that the British were not going to be fit enough to win. There's also increasing economic competition at this time, when Britain, having been the most successful industrial nation, is now meeting competition from other growing economies, again, particularly Germany, also the United States. Part of the Russian economy, the Italian economy, they're all growing. And British people are getting worried that they're going to lose out. And see, one of the answers is improving the physical fitness of the population. So there are movements trying to improve healthcare, to increase physical exercise, generally to improve the quality of the population. And then on the other hand, proposals to diminish the mentally and physically weaker parts of the population by preventing people who are defined as mentally and physically unfit from having children. And there are proposals, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, to prevent unfit people from having children, either by putting them in institutions, like these unmarried mothers who are put in mental hospitals to stop them having more children, or by sterilisation. This was actually quite strongly opposed in the United Kingdom by people who argued that the answer to unfitness was better social policies and better standards of living, better medical care, better diet, and then people would grow up to be fitter, and improve the environment, improve water, and all the other things that contributed to people being sick. And this argument won out over proposals to sterilise or incarcerate unfit people. But it did become much more popular in other countries. For example, in Sweden there was a policy of sterilisation, also in parts of the United States, and then most extensively in Nazi Germany. So this eugenics movement, as it was called, is an important phenomenon in the demographic history, particularly of the 1920s and 30s, and goes on in some places into the 1940s, late 1940s. It's still being suggested by some people in Britain. I think it's mainly when the full information about what had happened in Nazi Germany comes out that people really turn against it in a big way. As I say, in Britain, the main concern was to try to improve healthcare And this is, as I'll say next week, it is definitely improving through the 1920s, 30s and 40s. But the birth rate went on falling into the 1930s, and at the same time life expectancy was rising because living standards were rising and healthcare was improving, so people were living longer. Though there were big social class differences, poorer people did not live as long as richer people. This led, by the 1930s, to a panic in Britain, and also in France particularly, about the ageing of the population, rather like we hear now. The number of old people is growing, there are fewer young people. This means there'll be fewer working people to support the old people, and this is causing problems and will cause problems in future. So everything that we hear, certainly in Britain, in Japan, in Germany, in most developed countries, exactly the same things were being said in the 1930s and 40s. After that, everyone forgot about it for a few decades until it all came back in the 1980s. But there were quite strong concerns about populations becoming old and weak. Also at the same time, in the 1930s particularly, the discipline of demography was growing for the first time. It becomes established, partly because of this interest in what's happening to the population, becomes a scientific activity. And demographers were making statistical predictions about the future population, assuming that the trends that were then happening would go on happening. The birth rate was going down, so it would go on going down. People were living longer, and that would go on. And so they were predicting that the British population, for example, would fall to under 40 million by 1970. In fact, by 1970, it was at least 10 million, more than that. And one does always have to be cautious about population predictions, because things can change. And they changed in Britain because the birth rate started to go up again during the Second World War and carried on going up until the late 1960s. And in fact, as I'll say later, similar things happened recently, that we had dire predictions like that in the 1990s. Then the British birth rate started going up again in 2001, and is still going up. And now our finance ministry isn't too worried any longer. You just can't predict. Well, the one thing we know about the history of population is you can't predict it. And it's not always clear why these changes happen. So the birth rate went up, but as it did in most European countries and in the United States, after the war, some countries it starts a bit later than in others. But before going on to migration, there's some the government debated what was happening to the birth rate in the 1930s quite extensively, but didn't know what to do about it. The demographic experts told them that there really wasn't very much they could do to persuade women to have more children once they discovered that they didn't have to, and advised that methods like paying large allowances to women to encourage them to have more children of the sort that were introduced in Mussolini's Italy and in Hitler's Germany really were not very effective. So the government didn't do anything about it because it couldn't think what to do about it. And then, as I say, the birth rate went up again. The last really important aspect of population change that I haven't really talked about is migration. Throughout the 19th century, there was large-scale emigration from the whole of the United Kingdom to the United States and to growing British colonies like Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand. Mostly emigration by men, but a reasonable amount by women also. It's mainly migration by working people who are hoping to have a better life in the new colonies, and often did. Most of the emigration came from Ireland and also parts of Scotland, because they were the poorest parts of the British Isles, particularly Ireland. The migration was particularly strong from Ireland in the mid-19th century. There was a very serious famine in the 1940s, 1840s, which caused high death rates within Ireland and very extensive migration. Irish people migrated to the United States or to the colonies when they could, or they came to England, Wales or Scotland, which was cheaper and closer, and of course they could move back home more easily if they wished. There's a great deal of prejudice against the Irish in England, Wales and Scotland. They're the immigrant group who are the objects of most prejudice during the 19th century. They're the largest immigrant group. They were seen as different because they were Catholic, they had a different religion, which isn't very different from the Church of England, but different enough to make some people prejudiced. They were often very poor, and they were seen as living in overcrowded and bad conditions, making working conditions worse, the same sorts of complaints that are made about many immigrants now. There are also smaller groups of immigrants to Britain from various parts of Europe, either refugees from political persecution. Karl Marx, for example, came to England from Germany in the mid-19th century. And many Italians also came during the battles of unification in the 19th century. Many businessmen came from various countries to work in Britain, and also workers of various kinds, just as British workers worked all over the world, building railways particularly, and taking with them practices like playing football. So there's quite a lot of movement, and movement across borders was very much easier at that time. There weren't passports and all the kind of visas and all the things we have to go through now. Not to say the hassle of airports, but no doubt there are other hassles too. But movement was, there was less officialdom at least about movement across boundaries. Migrants from the British Empire, it was particularly easy because anybody born in the vast British Empire was British. They had British nationality and the full rights of British citizens if they came here. In fact, those rights were fairly limited, except for richer people, because most people didn't have to vote until the early 20th century. But it's interesting that, I mean, the British Empire, by the time of the First World War, covered about a quarter of the surface of the globe, and anyone born anywhere in that space counted as British. But they had to prove that they were British. And if they didn't have a birth certificate, which poorer people might not have, they couldn't prove it. This was a particular problem for men who came to Britain, particularly around the time of the First World War, as sailors working on merchant ships. They then wanted to stay in Britain, and many did. So there were quite long-established mixed-race communities in London, Liverpool, other big ports. But they would often find that if they, say, became unemployed and wanted unemployment relief, they had to prove they were British. And if they didn't have a birth certificate, then they couldn't prove it and they wouldn't get it. But if they could prove, I've said that, it's much easier for richer people to move from the empire to Britain and to settle. But it did mean that the fact of the empire and a certain amount of movement between the colonies and Britain meant that Britain was used to this kind of movement to some degree. But by far the largest immigrant group before the Second World War were Jews fleeing from persecution in the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe from the 1880s onwards. There was really quite serious persecution. Many Jews fled to the ports, like Hamburg, for example. Most of them really wanted to go to the United States, but many of them ended up in Britain. Sometimes they couldn't afford to go to the States, but quite often they were just deceived by sea captains who would take a lot of money from them, and they'd be dumped at a port. They'd think they were in America, and they'd be in northeast England, which was a grave disappointment very often to them. Sometimes they were able to move on, but very often they settled. And so there were quite large immigrant Jewish communities developed, a very big one in East London, but also in other parts of the country, in the northeast of England, and in Manchester and other big cities. They got a certain amount, they were mostly very poor people, but there was a quite prosperous, established Jewish business community, many of them financiers, the Rothschilds, for example. And they gave a lot of support to the immigrants, partly because they were afraid that if they were very poor and appealed for welfare relief from the British community, this would increase anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish prejudice. And there was quite a lot of that around already. Though in fact, by the 1880s, the established Jewish community had just managed to overcome many of the prohibitions against Jews. They were allowed to stand for Parliament, for example, after the 1860s, whereas before they'd been forbidden. They were allowed to attend Oxford and Cambridge universities, the most elite universities, whereas previously they'd been excluded. So before the mid-19th century, the Jews were excluded from, so actually were Roman Catholics, from most forms of, certainly of influential life, and had very limited civil rights. They had the rights to use the law courts. But the Jews had just managed to overcome many of those prohibitions when in came this very large number of very poor Jewish people. And they were very worried that this would bring a revival of anti-Jewish feeling, which in fact it did. But by setting up welfare institutions and schools for the immigrants, the established community helped them to settle and also did something to improve relations with the rest of the population. But there were demonstrations, riots, particularly in East London, against the Jewish immigrants, a lot of hostility. And this led to the first restrictions on immigrants in legislation in 1909 and again in 1915. 1915 was, of course, during the war. And during the war, hostility became even greater. Many of the older Jewish immigrants, the established rich ones, came from Germany. And because the war was against Germany, in people's minds, Jews and Germans were all mixed up and they were all the enemy, even though many Jewish people actually fought in the British Army during the war. But it did mean for the first time that people who were not British subjects had to overcome, had certain prohibitions. They weren't allowed full rights when they moved into the country. They had to go through certain processes, pass certain tests, including language tests, to be accepted as British citizens. And this had not previously happened. So there were first barriers against immigrants. But it doesn't apply to people who can prove they're born within the empire. It applies to people who do not have a right to British nationality. There was then a smaller influx of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. There were restrictions on the numbers then also, but less hostility, and meant that on the whole they were much better off, able to support themselves, unlike the earlier Jewish population. But many of the 19th and early 20th century Jewish immigrants by that time had become settled and established and accepted. So I'll stop there for now. Are there any questions or comments before we have a short break? Not President Kai to ask questions this week. So. Or if those of you who came in late want to ask anything about what happened before. Indeed.
I would ask two questions. The first one, I think it's not so important, but I was just wondering what is with Scotland? Why is it so liberal in terms of these issues?
Yeah. It's difficult because it's a bit surprising because the dominant church in Scotland is actually a rather strict Protestant church. I think the difference in the divorce law was that the church believed very much in equality of human beings. And so if you're going to have, say, divorce, then it has to be the same for men and women. But why they allowed divorce when the other churches didn't, I don't understand. And nobody I know in Scotland seems to understand. The illegitimacy rate, again, seems, as I suggested about Japan, seems to be characteristic of certain kinds of communities, regardless of the country almost. And there was higher rates of illegitimacy in rural England and Wales as well, compared with the towns. And that goes on into the 20th century. Whether it's just easier for women to support themselves in the countryside, that may have been so. And so, it had become established as a practice. Nobody seems to have explanations.
Another question was, so migration was a major role, took a major role in the changing birth rate. I mean, it declined until 1930s and it went up. So
yeah.
It's like emigration was maybe a factor of the birth rate going down, and immigration was a major factor going up.
No, it doesn't. I'll talk about the rise in the birth rate in my next lecture. It doesn't seem to be. And emigration really starts before the 1870s. So it doesn't seem to be a big factor in it going down. And immigration becomes a factor, but not really until the late 50s and 1960s. And even more now, it is one of the big reasons why the birth rate is going up now. That and the fact that older mothers are having more children. I think I'll come back to this. But migration doesn't seem to be such a big influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's something that's going on with the home population. And I think it is people realizing that they really can have a better standard of living if they don't have too many children. And also mothers, were women, realizing they can have better lives and better health if they're not constantly pregnant, having miscarriages, having children. Because obviously it was very bad for women's health. You have so many experiences like that. And also they're getting more advice from welfare clinics, people telling them how to restrict their births, and how to look after themselves and look after their children. So I think more information going around, women's organisations advising, particularly working class women. I think all of that has a very big impact, and that's even more so in the 1920s and 30s, when there's a very active women's movement. And part of, I'm actually just examining a PhD thesis, which is all about the birth control movement in the 1920s and 30s. And there were large women's organisations which set up clinics to advise women, give free contraceptives to poor women. And precisely for this reason, not because they believed particularly there ought to be a very low birth rate, but because it was bad for mothers' health and bad for the children if there were too many children in a poor family. So I'm sure there's more of that beginning in the 19th century, and that people haven't really researched. So it's quite interesting.
was just wondering if the birth rates, the health of the children and the health of mothers and things like that, was it very much a women's problem, more of a women's concern rather than of the men's? As in, were the men not as concerned?
Yes, I think many men obviously were concerned about babies dying and the poverty of the family. So I think these decisions about, well, obviously it takes both people in a partnership to make these decisions. And it was very often the man who had to wear a condom, or you know, they had to decide together they were going to give up sex when they'd had enough children, which does seem quite a lot did. But again, what many of these women in the 1920s and 30s found was that giving up sex put such strain on marriage that actually advising women on how to use contraceptives instead was good for the marriage. So men were concerned, and men talked about it among themselves, and there were men active in the birth control movement. But it's mainly women who, above all, particularly middle-class women, who've got the time to devote to this kind of thing, because middle-class women weren't allowed to work. So they often devoted themselves to charitable causes, and this was one of them. So it is a concern for most, but and the health issue is a more immediate one for women whose own health is affected, obviously, but it obviously was it would worry their husbands.
In today's Britain, do people see that immigrants taking in many immigrants actually helped pushing up the birth rate? Are people happy with that?
I'll talk about this a bit later. There's a lot of hostility to immigrants in Britain, as there is in many European countries. I don't think the birth rate issue is that many people are aware of that. They blame them rather for driving down wages, which probably isn't true. It's more the case that they'll take jobs that British people won't take, which are low paid. But then, I guess if they weren't there, the employers would have to pay more. And they were putting pressure on schools and housing because the government hasn't made adequate provision. And just the kind of racist hostility there is in many countries. It's not as bad. We haven't got a successful far-right racist political party. They've actually, well, the parties exist, but they've been very unsuccessful, I'm glad to say. Unlike, say, the Netherlands, where there's quite a successful right-wing party. And even in Sweden, in the most recent elections, the right did very well. But it is an issue, but they haven't, so we'll come back to this later. there haven't been riots or as there were in the 1950s, 60s. And London is a very, very mixed-race city. And it's quite extraordinary. And it's just not a white city. It's extraordinarily mixed. And extremely peaceable. And there hasn't been real trouble in London. Or there are gang fights. They're not necessarily racist fights. They're fights amongst young people. So it's on the whole, there are more successes, and it's more success than a failure in immigration. But there's always an undercurrent of hostility.
So it's not like people see the immigrant that they made contribution to Britain's class rate issue by pushing out class rate.
No, I don't think people see it that way. I mean, people who see demographic issues still see it that way. And they know it's that way, and it's obviously one of the, if you're worried about the fact you've got too few young people in the population, then young immigrants is part of the answer. You might say it's not a good idea to take young people away from other societies in order to prop yours up. But again, the sort of people who are anti-immigrant don't think that way either. So no, I don't think there's much awareness of that. If anything, there's more resentment that immigrants have got young children, they're taking up space in schools. But often that's come about because the government has allowed immigrants to concentrate in certain areas, but hasn't given enough support to often quite poor areas to provide enough schools, enough housing, enough care for a larger population. And that's a matter of policy. Should we have a break now for 15 minutes or so? So we'll come back in 15 or 20 minutes.
一生懸命に話したのと、そしたら私とエレベーターの中で話したら、彼いきなり私に日本語で話しかけるから。
ですね。
あの1時間は何だったんだって落ち込んでた。
I'm just waiting for Aki to come back. We'll start.
が今住んでる家にゲームがこうその家族の
Okay, let's start again. Right, I'll carry on talking about population from the Second World War until now. As I was saying earlier, there was a lot of concern in the 1930s and during the Second World War about the falling birth rate and the ageing population. It took people a while to realise that the birth rate was going up again, or that the rise in the war wasn't just a short-term blip. The numbers of people over 65 worried them because they doubled between 1900 and the 1930s. Only about 5% of the UK population were aged over 65 at the beginning of the century. That was actually historically exceptionally low because of the high birth rate of the 19th century. Even in the 18th century, about 10% of the population had been over 60, 65. By 1931, it had gone up to 10% again. Most of the older people were female, but almost in most times and places throughout history that has been so, because women outlive men. Seem to have some genetic advantage that ensures that in most times and places women live longer, but aren't necessarily more healthy and certainly not richer in later life. Women are more likely to be poor when they're old, and indeed when they're young. But because of all this concern about both the low birth rate and increasing numbers of old people, the government during the war set up a Royal Commission, a government investigation into what was happening to the population, hoping to find out why the birth rate was going down and whether anything could be done about it. As I've said, in fact, the birth rate was already going up, but nobody realised that it was going to be sustained for a long time. The reasons why it went up during the war are not very clear. It may have been more couples deciding to have children quickly in case the father didn't come back, or there might be a long delay if he was abroad for a long time. But it's not clear exactly why there's a rise at that time. And the Royal Commission didn't report until after the war. And it actually suggested that instead of worrying so much, there was actually much that was good about having a lower birth rate and having people living longer. It was good that there weren't too many children in each family, so family living standards could be higher. It was good for women for the reasons I discussed earlier, that they were healthier if they didn't have too many pregnancies. And it was a good sign for the country that people were living longer, because that also meant that people were healthier. They had better diets, better living standards. So in general, what was happening to the population should be seen as a sign of development in a favourable direction, and certainly towards improved standards for everybody. And basically they suggested that British society would have to come to terms with what was a permanent demographic shift of fewer children in each family and longer lives. But this was a normal part of economic development, and in fact it has been everywhere. The numbers of children go down and life expectancy grows. So they recommended that the country should think much more positively about the role of older people in society, instead of just talking about them as a burden and a cost of pensions and healthcare. Look more positively at what they were able to contribute, at their capacities, and make more use of them. In particular, they recommended that there should be an end to the trend towards earlier retirement from work, retirement at earlier ages. Basically, what had always happened was that rich people were able to retire whenever they wanted, because they could afford it. And poor people went on working until they dropped, because they couldn't afford to give up work. In Britain, there were old age pensions from the beginning of the 20th century. In Germany, they existed earlier, in the 1880s. But certainly in Britain, the pensions were very low. They were the very poorest people. And they weren't enough to give anyone an incentive to retire. But what happened after the Second World War, and I'll say more about this next week, is that pensions improved and more people retired from work at age 60 or 65. And the Royal Commission, like others at the time, thought this was just what should not be happening at a point at which more people were living longer. They should be discouraged from retiring quite so early. So it was recommended that more use should be made of the skills of older people, assisted by new technology, which could help people to keep working longer. The Royal Commission didn't believe that women could be encouraged to have more children once they'd learned not to, and so valuing older people was one positive way forward. Though they also pointed out that a smaller workforce of young people could also be replaced by encouraging more women to come into the workforce and also encouraging immigration. And I'll talk about both of those later. But the ageing population also encouraged research into the work capabilities of older people, which was very positive. It discovered that people could go on learning new skills later in life. But although people, say in their 60s, might lose certain capacities, they could compensate for this in the workplace through their experience, and also because they tended to work with more concentration and reliability than younger people. So they reckon many people in their 60s were certainly as efficient as people in their 20s and early 30s because of their accumulated experience and their capacity for concentration. So they argue that older workers are being undervalued and more could be made of them. And after the war, the government tried to encourage employers to keep older people on at work. But employers weren't convinced. Also, workers, now that they'd got rather better pensions, wanted to have some time off. And many of them had had very long working lives. At this time, many of them would have started work at age 13, sometimes age 12. They'd have done manual work throughout their lives. And by the age of 65, they wanted a rest. And it was becoming possible with better pensions. Often also their children had better work and could give them more support. So a combination of many workers wanting to retire and employers preferring to employ younger people when they could, or women or immigrants, meant that retirement actually spread and became normal for most people after the Second World War for the first time. Some workers didn't want to retire and in fact found it rather scary, the prospect of having nothing to do, having worked all their lives. Suddenly having no work was quite frightening for many men. For women it was much easier because they'd always done domestic work and they generally had closer relationships with children and women friends. It was less of a break, whereas for men it was a very real break with their friendships, with the life they'd known for a long time. But against this background, retirement became part of a normal phase of life after the Second World War, as it hadn't before. And the use of female labour and immigrant labour grew. The government encouraged women whose children were older, who were at school or had left school, to stay in the workforce after the war or to come back into the workforce. They weren't so enthusiastic about young women working because they wanted them to marry and have children. And they were encouraged to stay at home. They were encouraged to stay at home, to care for their children. There was very little childcare available. Childcare, day nurseries had very much improved during the war, when women were needed in the workforce, including young women. And nursery places for young children had greatly expanded. But after the war, they were closed down, and younger women were, mothers of young children were not expected to work. There were great social prohibitions against it. But then women were in the workforce, they were hardly ever doing the same jobs as men. There's still a strictly divided labour force. But there were new kinds of work opportunities opening up with the growth of a welfare state after the war, as I'll talk about next week, more health services, expansion of education and social services. This created a lot of work for women at all, well, at most levels. Women were still very rarely doctors, but they were nurses and assistants of various sorts, cleaners in the health service, receptionists. Similarly, they were very rarely heads of schools, but they were school teachers, and again, the cleaners. They provided the dinners. This all created more work. And business also expanded, as did other activities of government, creating more secretarial and administrative jobs for women. So bringing women into the workforce was important to this expansion of the operations, both of the economy and the state, after the war. And there was full employment, more or less, from 1945 until the early 1970s, the longest period of full employment in peacetime in Britain. The British economy benefited after the war from the fact that other economies were having to reconstruct themselves, including Japan and Germany, having to reconstruct their economies. and also were not, for the time being, there as competitors. When they did reconstruct, then the British economy began to suffer by comparison. But meanwhile, this post-war situation created a lot of jobs in Britain. Immigrants were recruited to fill the labour shortage. In the late 1940s, many of them came from Europe, people who'd been displaced by the war in various ways. Many Poles and East Europeans came to work in Britain. Quite a lot of Poles had been in Britain during the war. They fought in the Air Force, particularly alongside British soldiers, and many of them then settled in Britain, particularly around London. But others who'd been displaced from their homelands by the various movements of people during the war came to Britain on work contracts. Also some German and particularly Italian prisoners of war who'd been in Britain stayed on, and there's also more immigration from Italy because its economy was in a bad shape after the war. So for a few years there was quite a lot of European immigration. These numbers tailed off in the 1950s as the rest of Europe reconstructed itself. And then the main source of recruitment for from among migrants was from British colonies and former colonies. At this point, decolonisation is beginning. More countries from the British Empire are gaining independence, starting with India and Pakistan, or what was initially just India and then divided into India and Pakistan in 1947. And then gradually through the 1950s and 60s, most of the empire disintegrated and it was no longer called the Empire, but the British Commonwealth. But the main recruitment for work in Britain was from the West Indies, where the economy was in particularly bad shape. There had been very high unemployment and unemployment riots before World War II. And the other main source of recruitment were the former colonies of India and Pakistan. The government sent missions to the West Indies to recruit workers, particularly to work in public transport, which was expanding. It was also essential to the economy, but was fairly low paid and not attractive to British workers. Also, numbers of nurses were recruited to staff the expanding health service. Very often the migrants who came were very highly qualified, but ended up doing much lower skilled jobs because there was prejudice against them in higher level occupations. So graduates would end up working at railway stations. Migrants from India and Pakistan came more in the 1950s and after, generally to work in factories, such as textile factories and shoemaking, where many of them had experience at home. And some, either initially or later, set up their own businesses, particularly shops. Large numbers of Indian and Pakistani shopkeepers in Britain still. They were all at this point citizens of what was now called the British Commonwealth, and so were British citizens. If they'd been born while their country belonged to Britain, as part of the empire, they were still British and still had all the rights of British citizens. and more of them at this point were able to prove it. This was confirmed in the British Nationality Act of 1948. Even countries that were independent, Ireland, for example, became fully independent and left the Empire and Commonwealth in 1922. But the Irish have always kept a special status. They have equal status in Britain. Whether we have equal status in Ireland, I never put to the test actually, but I could go and vote in Ireland. But the Irish have retained that sort of status, unlike people from other countries. But immigrants, particularly from the West Indies and Asia, immigrants of a different colour, faced a great deal of prejudice. They found it very difficult, for example, to find housing. People were very unwilling to let rooms to black people. They were often very unwilling to let them to Irish people as well. And they experienced a great deal of discrimination every day in work and in housing. So they lived often in overcrowded houses in poorer parts of towns and did the worst work. For example, in factories, doing the work at night that British workers didn't want to do. But often willing to work in order to send money back home to support their families. In 1958, there were the first riots against West Indians, particularly in the Midlands of Britain. And growing hostility. Partly because by the late 50s there were growing concerns about the state of the economy and whether there would always be jobs, and this was causing discontent. But racism can't always be explained quite so rationally. This kind of hostility to immigrants led in 1962 to the government passing the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which restricted immigration and the rights even of people born in the Commonwealth. They had to have visas, not everyone was allowed to come in. And they weren't immediately allowed full citizenship rights. Again, Ireland was exempted from this. And it was a direct result on the part of the response by the government to racist sentiments, anti-immigrant sentiments in the country. In response to this, anti-racism organisations began to develop. The Campaign Against Racial Discrimination was founded in 1964. But then in 1965, a Race Relations Act made race discrimination illegal. Obviously only if it was open and people could prove it that they really had not got a job or got a house because of race. And it wasn't always very easy to prove. And people didn't always know their rights. But the law also set up a commission for racial, Community Relations Commission. Was its later name? I've actually forgotten what its name was at first, but it was an official body whose job was to help people who felt they'd been discriminated against and to support them in taking legal action. It was to ensure that often quite poor people were able to use the law. Alongside this immigration continued, and in 1968 there were further restrictions. For example, it became harder for immigrants to bring members of their families into Britain to follow them. They could, but it was a much more complicated process. But still, immigration continued because it was still, whatever the conditions, preferable for many people from the West Indies or from Asia to come to work in Britain, that they had work, and what to them were quite reasonable incomes, despite discrimination and bad conditions. And some of them were doing better and could support other immigrants who were coming in. There was yet another piece of restrictive legislation in 1971. And in fact, there's been a gradual process of restricting the rights even of people who were born British citizens ever since the 1960s. I'll return to immigration later and go back to talking about births and marriages. So what was also happening between 1945 and the early 1970s, as I described last week, were important changes in births, in marriages, and also, as it happens, in deaths, because death rates were still going down. The rise in the birth rate continued from the Second World War through to the end of the 1960s. It didn't mean that the number of children in each family went up. Notably, the average family size was 2.5, which obviously means that quite a number had 3 and quite a number had 2. But what was happening was that more people were getting married and more families had children. There seemed to be lower rates of infertility, of people unable to have children, which again must be associated with better standards of living and better health. And also by the post-Second World War period, most babies survived to be adults. There's very low infant mortality. So people know that if they have 2 children, those children will survive, which is a very different situation from the early part of the century, when high infant mortality was a problem not only of poor families, it happened in rich families also. And also, though I didn't mention it, I should have done, there are quite high levels of maternal mortality, deaths of women in childbirth before the Second World War. And this again was not just true of poor women. It happened most to women giving birth to their first child, and happened mostly because they acquired an infection after the birth. There's an increased move to the childbirth to take place in hospitals in the 1920s and 30s. Before that, most mothers had had their children at home. In the case of richer people, this was often because there was less infection in the home than in hospitals. For poorer women, there was often a lot of infection at home as well, but they couldn't afford a hospital. But there was more middle-class confidence in hospitals by the 1920s and 30s, but still quite high death rates of mothers. What put an end to maternal death rates was the discovery of antibiotics at the end of the 1930s. penicillin, for example. Well, penicillin was the first big example. So for the first time, infections that women got, very serious infections women got after childbirth, could be controlled by drugs, and they were very successful drugs. So the maternal death rate went down very sharply, very quickly. And these kinds of drugs, of course, also assist survival rates of other people, including older people. Many older people had died of pneumonia after suffering other kinds of illnesses, but now this could be controlled by modern drugs. So mothers were surviving and children were surviving. But another very important reason why there were more children was the higher marriage rate. Very few people don't marry. I said earlier, quite a high proportion of both men and women have never married. After the war, almost everybody marries, sometimes more than once. And they married younger, around age 22 for women, whereas traditionally it had been about 25, and on average about 24 for men, whereas again it had been higher. The reason for this, as usual, we don't really know, but it's quite likely it's because more people are better off and can afford to marry at earlier ages. People are in full employment and can earn more. By marrying younger, women were likely to have more children, but there's also increased use of birth control by more couples by this time. And it did mean that if women started their families younger, and they usually had their first child quite soon after marriage, and then had a second child quite soon after that, they would then have more of their lives to live after their children grew up, and would usually give up work to look after their children, and then go back to work later. Also, as I mentioned last week, marriages lasted a long time, longer probably than any time in history, because people lived longer. So if they married in their 20s, they were likely to be married for at least 40 years, and divorce was still quite difficult to get. So whereas before that, marriages had often been broken by death because of higher death rates, if they weren't broken because one or other partner left. And after that, from the early 1970s onwards, they're very often broken by separation and divorce. So this period from about 1945 to the early 1970s is a historically quite unusual one in terms of what's happening to marriage and population. Then, from the late 60s and through the 1970s and 80s, there were very important changes. Again, as I mentioned last week, there were important legal and cultural changes. After 1969, divorce became easier. After 1967, abortion became legal for the first time. Also, the birth control pill was produced in the 1960s and is made available easily on the National Health Service from the late 1960s. And it's a more effective form of birth control and also a more comfortable one than any other that existed. So very quickly became popular. And what followed from that was a falling birth rate, a very rapid increase in divorce. The fall in the birth rate went on until the end of the century, till 2001. There's a rapid increase in divorce, and I gave the figures for that last week. Most divorces being initiated by women. There were fewer people got married, and those who did married at later ages. By the mid-1980s, it had returned to an average marriage age in the mid-20s. And then, by the 21st century, it had gone up to, on average, 32 for men and 30 for women. It's still somewhere around that, probably slightly higher. So fewer people get married, and they get married when they're older. Unmarried cohabitation became openly accepted, whereas before it had always been secret. And now people are living together because they choose to, and not because they can't get a divorce and would maybe rather be married but can't be. There always had been some people who had chosen not to marry on the grounds that they didn't believe they needed the church or the state to convey their blessing on their commitment, so that their commitment to one another was enough. But they'd mainly been intellectuals, and rather a small number of people, as far as we know. But it becomes just socially acceptable for people openly to live together without marriage. And unmarried motherhood becomes acceptable and much less stigmatized. But in, I think it's 1982, it's in the early 1980s, the word illegitimate was removed from the law in Britain. The word was simply not there. For example, national statistics no longer talked about illegitimacy. They talked about children of unmarried parents. So the word, because it had such stigma attached to it, is just removed from all government documents and from the law, and legal differences between children whose parents were and were not married were removed. So by the end of the 1980s, 1/3 of all babies who were born had parents who were not married. But normally both parents registered, they were the parent and the child was registered. It was acknowledged, and they were often living together. And these are international shifts in developed countries, this time certainly true all over Europe. So it's a very rapid cultural change, a throwing off of old values, the values of older generations. And why it happens is not easy to explain. Partly it's a new generation that's more confident and better educated than many of its predecessors. The birth control pill enabled people to have sexual relationships before marriage without the fear of pregnancy that had always been there. And so that made people rather more willing to experiment. Also, the very large number of divorces which followed the 1969 Act suggests that many marriages before 1969 could not have been very happy. The suddenness with which they broke down afterwards suggests that they can't have been in good shape. So maybe many of the young people who were becoming mature from the late 60s and 70s had grown up in unhappy homes and were very cautious about rushing into marriage and replicating that. So perhaps wanted to experiment and make sure they really could get along with somebody before they married. That may have made a change, but as I say, we don't really know. And the changes happened despite the efforts of the government to stop it. Between 1979 and 1997, there were conservative governments who had very orthodox views about marriage. Certainly, the governments led by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s were constantly talking about the importance of encouraging marriage. Yet, the movement away from marriage had never moved faster. Quite the opposite happened. So there was really nothing that the government could do to, it certainly wasn't doing anything to encourage it was trying to stop it, but it wasn't able to stop it. So it's very interesting and really quite major cultural shift. So I would say by the end of the 1980s, 1/3 of all babies were born to unmarried parents, which was higher than had ever been known, and was certainly not something the government was keen to encourage. The other thing that must have made a difference was that women were more independent. Changes like the Equal Pay Act in 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, which I discussed last week, increased women's opportunities. They had more opportunities for higher education, better jobs. And so probably wanting more control of their own lives, so less willing to get married young and be tied down by children. So I think this is, and that was moving particularly fast in the 1980s. It's in the 1980s that university numbers, for example, expanded and at last reached the same sort of levels as much of the rest of Western Europe. And women had not equal work opportunities, but greater opportunities. I think they're also being encouraged by their parents much more by the 1980s to think about careers, whereas women had been held back before by the assumption that they would marry and have children, so it didn't matter if they did well at school or went to university. I think attitudes are shifting by the 1980s. Partly because parents are aware of the growth of divorce and that their daughters may not be able to rely on a man for the rest of their lives. They may have to be self-supporting. And so it's important that they get a good education and a good job. And this again feeds into a rather greater sense of independence. So I think that must again be part of the story, because what was going on at that time must be very complicated. But this change didn't affect all social groups. For example, the by this time quite large Muslim population, they're not as big as it is now. It was not acceptable to have an illegitimate child, live with somebody when you weren't married, not acceptable even to marry or go out with someone who was not a Muslim and not approved of by your parents. Obviously there are some emancipated Muslims who get out of this, but the culture within the community is very different from the kinds of changes that were going on. And also true in some other communities, there's still a lot of Roman Catholic hostility to birth control, to abortion, even to people, marrying people who are not Catholics. But more Catholics reject that. It's a more open religion. But there were cultural differences within Britain as within all other countries. And staying with women for a moment, although it was true that they could get better jobs and could support children, they were still tended to be poorer than men, especially after divorce. Well, the falling birth rate from the late 60s, during the early 70s it begins, again caused another panic about the ageing of the population. As I said, everyone had forgotten about the previous panic by this point and didn't learn any lessons from it. For example, about how older people could contribute to the economy. That's all been completely forgotten. As you can see from the figures, people were living decidedly longer by the end of the 20th century. The birth rate at the beginning of the century the life expectancy at birth was only 51 for men and 58 for women. But this didn't mean that most men died at 51 and women at 58, because life expectancy at birth was reduced by the very high infant mortality rate. Life expectancy at birth averages in death rates throughout life. So if a lot of people die before the age of 1 or 3, then that pulls down the average very drastically. So what that number means was a lot of people were dying in the first year of life. And those who managed to live to 20 had a very good chance of living into their late 60s, 70s, and later. People often misinterpret these statistics to mean that there really weren't any old people in the past. But it's just a simple misunderstanding of statistics. And the growth that you can see then in life expectancy is partly due to falling infant mortality and falling death rates in early life, but is also genuinely due to more people living longer. So by the beginning of the 21st century, life expectancy, with very few people dying as children, is up to 81 for men and 84 for women, and has gone up further since then. And around 20% of the whole population are now aged over 65. Again, that's partly because there's a lower birth rate, so fewer younger people. It was true in 2001, the birth rate's been going up, and so it's slightly less now. And also, as always, these average national statistics disguise quite big social class differences, which also sometimes regional differences. For example, Glasgow, which is the biggest city in Scotland, has some of the inner city part has some of the lowest life expectancy in the country, because it's one of the poorest places. Glasgow has always been a very poor city. Though not as much now as it used to be. On average, poorer people had shorter lives by around 3 years, but it could be more. And as again you can see from the statistics, women have a longer life expectancy right through the period. As I said, there's a return of panic about aging, because it was assumed that the birth rate, it was assumed as it was assumed in the 1930s, that having dropped, the birth rate would go on being very low. And again, there were dramatic projections ahead to 2050 about how this continuing low birth rate, while more people were living ever longer, would cause a serious imbalance in the population. And there are similar concerns throughout Europe and in other countries, including Japan. Slightly less in the United States, because their birth rate is somewhat higher, because a higher immigrant population mainly. Though they're actually beginning to age quite fast now. The solutions that were suggested to this were, again, that people should not retire at such early ages, but should stay in the workforce. And certainly by the 1980s and 1990s, people were staying healthier to later ages. They're not just living longer, but they're fit and active until later in life, and so are better able to work. And the conventional retirement ages in Britain were 65 for men and 60 for women. There was 65 for both until 1940. And then some older women started campaigning because they felt there was discrimination against older women in the workforce, and they were forced out, and they were demanding a lower pension age, which they got in 1940. But that's had to be reversed because a man brought a case to the European Court under sex discrimination legislation, saying it was unfair to men that they had to work an extra 5 years, which it was, certainly by the 1980s. And so now the pension ages are being, retirement ages are being equalised. But again, it took a long time to persuade people to retire later or to persuade employers. And in fact, in the 1980s, more people were retiring at earlier ages. This was true throughout Western Europe. It's partly because the economies of Western Europe are not doing well. There's quite high unemployment. And so employers were quite eager to get rid of older workers because they were more expensive. And so something like a third of all West European workers had retired before the age of 60 by the late 1980s. But through the 1990s and early 2000s, this has been reversing. More people have been staying on at work. It's partly because of growing costs of living. People feel they need to work longer, but also more want to. Also in 1999, the European Union introduced an age discrimination, an anti-age discrimination directive. And employers are not supposed to get rid of workers just because they've reached a certain age. They're supposed to be employed if they're capable of doing the work. The UK government, as usual, didn't completely implement what the European Union wanted, and did keep a retirement age of 65. Beyond 65, workers can ask their employer to stay on, but the employer can say no and not give any reasons. But it is being proposed to get rid of that. So people are tending to, more people are working past retirement age, and rather more use is being made of older workers. But it does carry with it a danger that we get back to the historic situation where the poorest workers carry on working till they drop, because pensions are not very good in Britain, whereas the rich can afford to retire and enjoy themselves. But that's been one response to an ageing population. And of course it's an issue throughout Europe, and there were major strikes in France a few weeks ago because the government wants to raise the minimum retirement age, which in France is 62, though to get a full pension you have to stay on until at least 65. But it did cause a great deal of unrest in France. But then in 2001 the birth rate started to go up again, which was quite unexpected, and I don't think people quite noticed for a while. It was rather like the Second World War. They didn't quite believe it. But it's continued. Its birth rate it was somewhat flatter last year, but it's continuing to rise. And the main reasons seem to be, on the one hand, more immigrants having children. They tend to be younger than the rest of the population. But also, and interestingly, these women who are marrying or entering a stable partnership later, having their first child in their late 30s or early 40s, but still having 2 or 3 children, which is a quite new phenomenon. And it's certainly very visible in the part of London where I live. And it's the professional middle classes more than any who are doing this. But and I haven't seen a real study of how extensive it is, but it's, according to the Office of National Statistics, those are the 2 changes that are happening. And it's the older mothers still having quite large families, and these are usually women who are already established in a career, or rather not children, 2 or 3 children, which is the interesting and rather surprising phenomenon. The United Kingdom is one of 7 European Union countries with a rising birth rate. And our Ministry of Finance is not now projecting a labour shortage, whereas a few years ago it was panicking about it. Now its latest public finance projections are that we don't have to expect a serious labour shortage. The other countries where the birth rate's going up, they include some very small ones like Cyprus and Luxembourg, but also France, where it's not rising as fast as in Britain, but it's rising, Belgium, Sweden and Ireland. Southern Europe birth rates started to go down later, but they're still very low. And Germany still has quite low birth rates. The Treasury also points out the numbers of dependent older people, that is those who can't work or not fit to work and need to be looked after, is actually lower in the United Kingdom than in the United States, Australia, France, Germany, Italy or Japan, which are the countries where the numbers of dependent older people seems to be the greatest. So there's less concern now about what's happening in Britain, although many people are living to be older. The population is coming more into balance. But of course, again, it's very hard to know what's happening in the future. Other countries' birth rates might turn around, or the British one might start to go down again. And it certainly happened in Britain, again, independently of government policy. It's not clear that anything that's been, I mean, the government hasn't exactly been encouraging immigration in recent years, and it hasn't done much to help mothers have children, particularly working mothers. And now a very high proportion of mothers of young children are in full-time employment. Childcare is still not very good. Though it has become rather better for poorer mothers under the Labour government that's no longer in office, and that may have helped some of them. But apart from the birth rates, I've said the other important contributor to the British labour market is continued immigration. Since the 1970s, as I said before, there have been ever tighter restrictions on immigrants from outside the European Union, unless they're very highly skilled. There's continuing racist hostility to them, particularly high anti-Muslim feeling after 9/11 in New York, and after there were a number of bombs in London in 2005. Though, as I was suggesting earlier, in general, immigration or people of different cultures live side by side reasonably peacefully, particularly in London, which is the most multicultural, multiracial city. In 1951, only 1 in 20 Londoners were born outside the United Kingdom, and many of those would actually be British people born in various bits of the empire because their parents were working there. By 1971, 15% of Londoners were born outside the United Kingdom. By 2001, about 45% describe themselves as non-white. And then in addition to that, there are large numbers of European migrants. And over 300 languages are spoken in London. London is unusual, but all the cities are really now racially very mixed. The tighter conditions on immigrants from coming in from outside the European Union have gone on alongside more migration from within the European Union. The European single market that was introduced in 1990 allows the EU citizens to move freely around within the European Union. And in fact, for quite a lot of highly skilled people migrating, well, certainly moving for some time to work in Britain, a lot of French people working in the finance sector in the City of London, for example. Very large numbers of French, and people from other countries. There have been quite a lot of Germans teaching in universities, because for a while we had no jobs for good graduates than there were in Germany. But then the expansion of the European Union to include more East European countries meant that quite a lot of poorer East European immigrants came to work in Britain from Poland, Ukraine, and other countries. And have become pretty indispensable for the building industry and also parts of the agricultural sector in Britain. Also, over the last couple of decades, there have been increasing numbers of refugees from wars, famines, various kinds of crisis in Africa and the Middle East particularly. So there have been many more people coming for much more diverse reasons and for a much greater variety of places. And although there have been restrictions on all kinds of immigration, and it's not easy for refugees to get permanent status. Many of them do achieve it. So the variety of immigrants has become really very noticeable. So immigration has become large and also much more complex in recent decades. And is very important for certain sectors of the economy, as I said, agriculture, building. Also caring. A lot of the care of older people is in the hands of immigrants, mostly women, but not all women, from other countries, who are often not given adequate training and are very badly paid. In fact, many of the immigrants are heavily exploited, low paid, and live and work in very bad conditions. And the governments, unless something really terrible happens, our governments have not been good at controlling this and improving conditions. It's a very big issue which deserves a lecture to itself, but I'm not an expert on it. But it certainly has become an important feature of the British population in the early 20th century. So I'll stop there, and again.